All right, good day to everybody. Welcome to another Faith Seeking Understanding episode. I am Allan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor and I'm a professor, a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, and a peddler of hope. And I am also the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Theology, Podcast Theology and Culture at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely made-up university, but a place where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things free of charge. And I'm excited today because this is actually a new series that we're going to offer called Believing is Seeing. And we're going to offer some kind of program every 4 to 6 weeks, maybe an interview, maybe something else. But I'm excited that the first person I get to interview today, and I've interviewed before, is Thomas J. Oord. Thomas is a theologian, a philosopher. He is a scholar of multidisciplinary studies, and he directs a doctoral program at Northwind Theological Seminary and the Center for Open and Relational Theology. Tom, how you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks so much. I'm honored to be a part of this.
Well, it is an honor to have you here, and I'm just we're going to talk about your latest book that I just love. And I see your background. Is that Idaho?
No, I was at
Okay.
a speaking tour in Scandinavia in April and May, and this is
Okay.
somewhere in the highlands of Norway.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah. And judging by your apparel, it's just a background. Anyway, you're wearing what you're wearing. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about your new book, and I'm going to put it up. This is in podcast and videocast. I'm going to put the book up on the screen for those who are watching. But if you're listening, I will put the link to this in the description. In fact, we're going to put links to Tom's website and other websites that pertain, and also to this book if you are interested. Let me call it up here so you can see the book cover. And there it is, Open and Relational Theology, an introduction to life-changing ideas. You know, one of the things I love about this book, and I love about your writing, Tom, is, first of all, it's very clear and readable. But
Thanks.
you've got the greatest, not only stories, but just wonderful lines, you know, talking about we don't believe in a distant God who sits up there drinking margaritas. I mean, I just love all that. It really makes the book just an even better read. The ideas are great, but makes it even better. So I just appreciate this book. And so we want to spend some time talking about open and relational theology here. And so can you do me a favor, and those who are listening a favor, and that is, what is open and relational theology?
Open relational theology revolves around two big ideas and then has lots of diversity under those two big ideas.
Yeah, one of the, let me make a quick point. One of the things you do in the book, which I really appreciate, is you talk about the diversity here and of the thinkers, and you outline certain, you know, we're not all in agreement here, but in general, here's the focus. So that's good. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. The word open refers to God's relation to time and an open future. And so open and relational thinkers don't think that God predestined everything from the foundation of the world. In fact, they don't even think God foreknows absolutely everything that's ever going to happen, because God is moving through time just like we're moving through time. Now, there's some differences. God had no beginning, we have, but still, this idea that God experiences moment by moment such that the future is open and not even known with certainty by God.
Yeah.
The relational part has to do with God being in giving and receiving relationships with not only humans, but most open and relational thinkers think God is in giving and receiving with all of creation. And for most people in the Christian tradition who, you know, read the Bible, this sounds like pretty obvious. But as you and I know from studying the academy, most of the major Christian theologians in history, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, John Calvin, Martin Luther, they all did not think God was influenced or affected by what we do. So relational theology says God really is affected by our prayers, our actions, what happens on the planet, etc. So that's open and relational in a nutshell.
Okay. So the first thing that I hear, and I know that it's because when I've talked about this, by the way, let me say that I think one of the things that's helped convince me to moving toward this is that I think that's really how the Bible presents it.
I do too.
I
I think
mean,
it
it
fits the
just
majority view.
it's just so clear. And I can remember before I started to embrace this view, the reality was I was doing a lot of hermeneutical gymnastics, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So like, the one I like to mention is the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. And God at
Good
the end of the
one.
story says, now I know I can trust you to Abraham.
Right.
It's like God didn't know he could trust Abraham until this. And then you've got to try to figure out, well, God, yeah, no, God knew, but so you got to go through this torturous logic
Yep.
to make sense of this. When if you just read the text, I mean, and that's only one example, right?
Yep. Right.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think of when I hear about the future is not yet known even to God. The first thing I think of is Paul, who says, "Those he foreknew, he also predestined."
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with that?
Yeah, it's a really troubling passage. And it's been troubling not only for open relational folks like me, but folks in the general Arminian
Yeah.
tradition, in their conversation with Calvinists. And
Mhm.
typically the answer is that what God foreknows and predestines are categories or abstract entities, we might say, if we're using philosophy. But God foreknows and predestines that a certain type of thing or person will, to use the Ephesians language, be conformed to the image of the invisible God and that sort of thing. So, what an Arminian and an open relational person might say is that Allan Bevere is not predestined from all eternity to be a Christian, but what's predestined is the characteristics that make up a Christian, and Allan can freely choose whether or not he wants to be a part of that and take on those characteristics.
Okay.
So that's how an open and relational person would typically handle that passage.
Yeah. So let me make a connection with another passage from Acts with the call or conversion of Saul in Acts 9. So Saul meets the risen Christ on the Damascus Road, and he tells Saul that he's chosen him to basically take the gospel to the Gentiles. Doesn't appear like Saul gets a choice in that matter, but he could have said no. Couldn't he? Couldn't he? After all of this dramatic experience, he could have gone to Damascus and says, I'm not going to do this. Is that possible?
I think it is possible. I
Yeah.
mean, it's hard to take a lot of the Pauline writing seriously when he talks about struggling with things,
Mhm.
as if Paul had no other choice but to go through these things.
Yeah.
Instead, it makes more sense to think that Paul is struggling, yes, but there's a choice he's making in the midst of it. He wants to stay true to the calling he's been given. He wants to go on to maturity, all that kind of language he uses.
Yeah.
So it is the case that God can give us callings. I think God calls everyone moment by moment to live a life of love. But that's not the same as entirely controlling us such
Right.
that we're robots in fulfilling that calling.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Um, you so let me talk about this thing about the future again. So typically we've got time and we've got eternity, right? And the typical view has been God sort of stands outside of time.
Right.
And one of the things also that I've appreciated, you mentioned too in this book, of course, the late John Polkinghorne, who was a theologian, physicist, and who's I know you and I both uh, imbibed deeply from the well of his thinking.
Yeah.
And he talks about time and eternity. And the other person, I don't know if you've read much of David Wilkinson.
Yeah, I know David
Yeah,
personally. Yeah.
yeah, David, and he's also kind of talked about these things and has really helped me shape my thinking. But if time is a creation, meaning it comes into existence at some point, and I think scientists are pretty clear that space and time are interwoven as some kind of a fabric. Um, where is God in that? Is there an aspect in which God is also still eternal, but in time, or has God chosen to become wholly immanent, so to speak, and be in this context? How does that work?
Yeah. Open and relational theologians, this is one of the areas in which there's two kind of main strands of thought.
Mhm.
One strand of thought, we'll call it Polkinghorne since you mentioned his, is the idea that God once existed timeless and then decided to create a world out or a universe out of absolute nothingness. And once that decision is made, God experiences time in relation to creation. But people like Polkinghorne and many others in that way of thinking oftentimes want to say that prior to creating the world out of nothing, God was a triune being,
Mhm.
and there was giving and receiving in the Trinity before creation ever came about. And if there's giving and receiving, that assumes a kind of a time sequence within God. So that way of thinking says you have a time sequence in God. Then once God creates a world, God experiences time in relation to creation.
Okay.
But time is really a part of God everlastingly.
Okay.
The other branch says, why think that God ever created out of nothing? Why not just think that God has everlastingly been creating? And the Big Bang of our universe was preceded by chaos of a previous universe. That way actually fits pretty well with the biblical text. There's no creation out of nothing in Genesis 1, for instance. And so both of these options are kind of on the table. The first one that I aligned with Polkinghorne is probably more popular or more commonly known.
Yeah.
The second one, actually, I've been trying to promote a little bit more on the second one because I think it's got some advantages, but
Yeah.
either one are acceptable to open
Okay.
and relational thinkers.
Okay. So part of the problem with this, isn't it, is that since you and I and everyone exists in time, it's hard for us to imagine to say this nonsensically, but make the point. It's hard to imagine a time when there was no time, right?
Right.
I mean, it's just so it's hard for us to pick that out. Okay, so God is here. God is with us. God is involved in relationship with us. And one of the things about your work is that you raise the point that is, and you've said it, is that in order to have genuine relationship, you've got to have time. You've got to have a give and take. You've got to
Yeah.
and to build relationship. And why? Um, I guess. I mean, I'm trying to think of the right way to say it, but there is. I mean, if God is relational, inherently relational, God wants to be in relationship with us. It's pretty hard for God to do that and not be in time. Isn't that right?
Right, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's as you mentioned, it's impossible for us to conceive of what that would look like if God is utterly timeless.
Yeah.
Now, what some people will say is, well, God is timeless. We just have to appeal to mystery. In some mysterious way, God is both timeless and in relationship with us.
Mhm.
But open and relational folks say, well, why go that direction? The Bible certainly doesn't require it. And our common sense experience and intuitions don't fit that way. So why not think that God is in real relationship such that moment by moment God is giving and receiving?
Mhm.
And for me personally, this makes sense on a number of levels, but how should I say this? I'm fundamentally motivated by the logic of love, the issues of love, because I think at the heart of the Christian scripture are the issues of love. And that this God of the universe, whom John says is love, and whom over and over is called the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever in the Old Testament, etc. If love is at the center, love seems to be essentially a giving and receiving, time oriented way of being. And so if we start with the loving God, it seems like you have to have a God who's open and relational.
Yeah. One of the great points in your book, I think you say something like, in the Old Testament, loving God, loving neighbor is the greatest commandment. Jesus affirms that. John affirms that. And yet theologians proceed otherwise. Something like that.
Yes.
That somehow that we don't seem to, we not seem to be able to embrace that even though that's what we get from the scriptures. So one of the things that I thought of when I was reading that part is, I mean, one of my bugaboos today is not about anything you said. Because I agree with you. But it's really important how you understand love, isn't it? Because love
Oh,
can be
yes.
sentimental. It can be, if someone says, well, it's just all about love. I mean, I know when some people, I have friends who, when they say that, I know that they certainly don't mean the kind of love that sends you to the cross, right? It's all sentimental and zappy and romantic, and it's frankly very shallow.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, how would you, when you think of this kind of love, this um, uh, giving love of God, giving and receiving, how would you want to, knowing that it's impossible to exhaustively define this kind of love, what would you say about this kind of love that God has for
Yeah.
us?
I would say we would be wise to start with a general definition of love and then explore the many forms that that definition takes.
Mhm.
So, my general definition would be something like this: to love is to act intentionally in relational response to God and others to promote overall well being, or to use more biblical language, to be a blessing, to promote abundant life, to enact shalom in the world.
Okay.
So that would be the general definition. It's an intentional action and relational response to God and others that tries to promote a blessing, the common good, well being. And then I would say God expresses a variety of forms of love. Sometimes it's self sacrificial, sometimes it's pure delight in the value and joy of creation. Sometimes God is the friend who we always need, working with us side by side. And you and I can express various forms of love as well.
Mhm.
So if we keep this idea that love's aim is what is good, excellent, well being, and then it can take a variety of forms. We can have a proper place for enemy love and self love, self sacrifice, and acting for the good of the self. This morning, I got up and brushed my teeth. I primarily did that because I don't want cavities. I wasn't thinking about you, Alan. I wasn't thinking about most other people, although, it is good to have a breath that doesn't smell bad. But I was mostly thinking about my own good. And I
Yeah.
think that's a real act of love. I don't always have to be, picking up beggars in the streets of Calcutta to show an act of love.
Right.
We can do it in a variety of ways. And I think God's also in that pluriform love expression business.
When you were talking about that, about self-love, and that there was, because you talked about how often we can give accounts of self-love as being selfish. And
Yeah,
of course, there's nothing, obviously it is true, we can become selfish,
sure.
but the one thing that it struck me is, after being a pastor for 38 years, is I got tired of watching good, faithful followers of Jesus so giving everything to the church that they just neglected themselves and burned themselves out. And then they
Mm,
wanted nothing to do with the church,
yeah.
right? And I started years ago, started to change my perspective on that, and telling people, and started to make rules. Like, I would say to our nominating committee as United Methodists, that's sort of our committee where we ask people to volunteer for certain positions. And I used to say to the nominating committee, we will not ask a person to do more than be on one committee. That's it. We won't. I don't care how many times you want to bring up, Jim Smith. We're only going to ask him to do one thing. And
Yeah.
I would actually start saying to certain people, you're already doing a lot, and we appreciate what you're doing, but you have a family, you have other responsibilities, you have other things, and you need to take care of yourself.
Yep.
Because one of the things that I sometimes I think happens in the church among leaders is, we need the job done. And I think it's natural to gravitate toward as I like to call them, the high capacity people, right? Who do
Yeah.
things and get things done. But what we end up doing is we end up overburdening them, and we actually push them into a kind of selflessness that is unhealthy.
Yep. I
And
totally agree. I
yeah,
think it was more common in the past for pastors to be in that scenario, but we've come around and seen the problems with that in terms of the burnout pastors
yeah,
face. But not enough people have then also asked the question, well, what about the people, the laity in the church?
Yeah.
Are they also in that scenario? And sounds like you've done a good job with that.
Well, and I also, with me also, when I was early in ministry, I picked up things I shouldn't have, and I finally got wise to that. And I finally started saying to leadership, if there was something that we needed somebody to do, I finally said, okay, folks, we just have to make a decision. Is there somebody that feels called and willing to do this, who is not already put upon a lot, or are we just willing to let this die? Because that's okay. That it's okay. Certain ministries come and go. Some ministries have their time, and then we move on to other things. And that can be, so we have to, if God builds Sabbath into the law, we need to be able to do that. But I've had pastor friends who have said, well, I don't take a day off because the devil doesn't take a day off. To which you got the wrong role model, right?
Yeah, I love it.
And we just need to that kind of love includes ourselves. It's not selfish. It's not selfish to
no
take some time and refresh. You talked about your hiking and the things, and you always on social media you give us these great photos.
Thanks.
Of being outdoors and everything. Let's talk a little bit about. So here's before we get into more specifics, here's what I want to say. So you want to say God is here, God influences, but God doesn't coerce.
That's right.
Correct. And we basically live that way. One of the strengths of the argument is that we live day to day as if this is true. We live day to day as if we have freedom. Right.
That's right.
I mean, I if I have a tough decision to make, I might pray about it, which is a good thing.
Sure.
I might speak to other faithful saints who I think are wise, and maybe God uses them to nudge me.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the decision I make is my own. I can't at the end of the day say, well, that didn't turn out all right, but that's obviously what God wanted me to do. Right.
Yep. That's right. Yeah.
And so let's talk about what it means for God to influence us, to be there, but not coerce us. That God is not going to, at the end of the day, force Tom Ord to do anything.
Yeah. That's a major issue in open and relational thought, and open and relational thinkers articulate that view of God's power in various ways. But they're in agreement that we have real free will, that God doesn't control everybody and everything all the time. My own particular way of talking about it is to say that God's love is uncontrolling. Love doesn't force its own way, to quote the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
And if God really does love us and really does love all creation, then God not only won't control, but I think God can't control, because love comes first in God. And that way of thinking helps with a ton of different questions that Christians often ask. Things like, why didn't God stop my sister's rape? Or why doesn't God prevent Putin from invading Ukraine? Or when it comes to scripture, how can this book of the Bible have so much wealth and wisdom, but also have some things that seem to contradict and don't make sense? You'd think if God was in control of the whole process, everything would be crystal clear and there would be no inconsistencies. And yet sometimes God's a forgiving God, and other times God wants to bash babies' heads against the rock. What's going on there? So it helps us solve that kind of big question. Or take some of the big issues of our current day, like the climate crisis. If God really cares about a planet that's going through all kinds of extinctions and problems based on climate change, well, why doesn't God just up and, snap a finger and fix it all? But if God can't, because God is loving and this love is uncontrolling, we can still talk about God as active, influential, in fact, I think the most powerful, but never a God who's controlling, which means that you and we have a real role to play in all of these aspects of creation.
Yeah. So God, it's not that God doesn't care about creation.
No.
He doesn't care about some of the destruction that we're doing, but the way God acts is to influence us and to find ways to nudge us, if you will, into
Right.
taking the kind of action that helps and assists in the care of the creation. So
That's right.
it isn't that God, as you said, is not up there unconcerned sipping margaritas. God is here,
Right.
but um, and I think folks ought to read this book just for all those lines. You've got a lot of good ones in there like that. They're great.
Thanks.
One of the most powerful stories you told in relating to this, and that's the other thing, the stories you tell and I know over the years, as you have said in the book, that you have actually had people writing to you. You've had a lot of conversations with people who have read your material and have said, this just solves so many problems I've been having and different things. But one of the great stories you tell is the family that's leaving in the snowstorm from the gathering, and they're stuck in the snow, and the dad's trying to push them out and can't. And so their daughter, 9 years old or something like that, goes inside where everyone else is and says, "Hey, can we get some help?" And the next thing you know, they all come out and they all push, and mom gets it on the, where there's no snow, and everything is, and you say in that story, God is the little girl, the 9-year-old girl who goes in, who influences. She's the in from the world standards, she's probably the least powerful person in the story. Right? But she's the one that really, she nudges and pushes and things happen. That's just I just love that story.
Oh, thanks.
We don't think like that. And one of my struggles has been too with the New Testament, not with the New Testament per se, but that we've got, the New Testament is replete with this kind of conversation about what God's power is and how we are to respond. Boy, we just seem, I don't know, do we just roll over that? Are we so stuck in worldly accounts of what power is and what getting results is that we can't, like you talked about love, you talk about, you can now, even with this kind of understanding now, we can really love our enemies. When most people will say, most Christians will say, and Reinhold Niebuhr's classic treatment of the Sermon on the Mount, well, Jesus is giving us some kind of ideal. We can't do that. You're saying the problem is it's our view of God is why we don't think we can do that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. That is the problem. I mean, you think about the kind of popular movies that come out of Hollywood that try to depict God.
Yeah.
The first one that comes to my mind is Bruce Almighty. It's probably been 20 years since that's come out. But you notice that in that particular movie, it's God's power that it becomes the issue. And Morgan Freeman, he might talk about free will, but really he's got the kind of power to do whatever he really wants to do. And he gives that to Jim Carrey momentarily. So if you start with that view of God, that God is either controls everything or could be in control and occasionally controls things, then there's so many problems that emerge. And we end up admiring the people who try to control others rather than admiring the people who are trying to woo and persuade. And really at the end of the day, I mean, you and I both have links to the Wesleyan tradition. A lot of ways, open and relational theology is just taking John Wesley's notion that God woos us rather than controls us. It takes that seriously, philosophically, theologically, biblically, sociologically, anthropologically, et cetera, takes that notion of wooing seriously and plays it out to its various dimensions. And that's why I think it does fit the intuitions of many, many people when they hear about open and relational thought.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's at least the people I know who embrace some form of this open and relational theology. If they're not Wesleyan, they sure have Wesleyan leanings. Interestingly enough,
Yep.
I sometimes wonder, Tom, if this is a tension that really ultimately is more between the Wesleyan Arminian tradition and the Reformed tradition. Is that
often
fair
plays
or not?
out that way. Yeah, it does play out that way a lot. I mean, you can You can come to open relational thought from a number of ways.
Yeah.
And one of them would be kind of a Wesleyan background. The Lutherans who come to open relational thought often come through the suffering Jesus, or the suffering God, the God of the cross. And that suggests a different view of divine power. The Anabaptists that typically come from a pacifist. Jesus isn't going to be violent, and therefore we ought to have a God who's not violent. So open relational theology fits.
Yeah.
The Roman Catholics who come to open relational thought oftentimes come through St. Francis or Teilhard de Chardin, those aspects of the Roman Catholic tradition that have kind of set aside the Thomas Aquinas view of God or the Augustine view of God and focus more on what love looks like in the world of science, etc., and then extrapolated from that about what God might be like.
Yeah.
So there's another number of ways you could come to open relational thinking, but I do think the Wesleyan tradition has some really natural proclivities
Yeah.
already built into it.
Yeah. So in other words, it was interesting you mentioned the different traditions, because I actually was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday who is a Lutheran pastor in town. Great guy, a real scholar. And we were talking about your book because he asked me what I was reading, and I was just sitting in there going through it. And I was surprised, but maybe I shouldn't be now, that he actually, he's let's just say he's got an openness to that idea.
Good.
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. Let me. I want to get to the question of suffering, because that's a big thing, and you mentioned that in your book. But first, I want to talk about when you mentioned atonement, and I appreciated your conversation on atonement. One of the things that has also bothered me about a lot of modern theology when it comes to atonement is, and I don't reject different theories of atonement outright. I think they've all got something to say, and I don't think they all adequately express it. But one of the things that has bothered me is that we spend a lot of time speaking about atonement is what God has done for us, and not enough about atonement as how Christ would have us live in the world. I think the cross. I mean, you can talk about the moral example thing of the atonement, but I actually think it's deeper than that. We don't look at the cross and say that's what. But even though Jesus tells his disciples and us to take up our crosses, we don't see it as the cross is how I'm to live in the world. I mean, we struggle with that 2,000 years later. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the major atonement theories have started with a particular view of God that ends up portraying God as unloving because God, wants justice or is just so pissed off and wrathful and has to have that satisfied in some way. Or they portray us, as you mentioned, as kind of just passive pawns in this metaphysical struggle between God and the devil, and we're just like, hoping the good guy wins so we get to go to the good side, rather than, as you mentioned, picking up our cross as if we have a real role to play in atonement. And I think the overall thrust of Scripture points to a role we have to play in this love relationship with God and others. And so why not bring that into the atonement theories themselves? Now, as you mentioned, the moral influence theory does have a role for us to play, but it's not as clear what Jesus's death has to do with that, where God, how we think about God. So there's some additional work to be done there, I think. But
Jesus says, "Love our enemies," and we're not sure what that means, but Jesus demonstrates that on the cross. But that's a little hard for us to go to that extreme. Now, I understand. I understand that, but it's there. It's there. You can't ignore it and avoid it, and we can't. I just don't think brushing it off as that's impossible for us. It's difficult for us. Clearly, not impossible.
It is difficult. Let me criticize our fellow Wesleyans here.
Absolutely,
Allan. Make some people angry if I haven't.
Yeah, let's do that. Well, I always say here at Faith Seeking Understanding, we are an equal opportunity annoyer. So feel free.
Well, you know, we in the Western tradition, we oftentimes talk about the problems of predestination understood in the Calvinist tradition, that God predestined things from the beginning of the world. But then when we get to atonement, all of a sudden it's just fine and dandy that God predestines the cross of Jesus. And
Hmm.
I think to myself, well, what's going on there? Doesn't Jesus have any freedom? Is this God? It does want to point to a sort of a wrathful kind of God. Um, what if we took out predestination from our atonement theories, especially the cross? What would that look like?
Yeah.
What would we say about Jesus being killed by the authorities and powers and principalities of his time, and what that looks like if it wasn't predestined from the foundation of the
Right.
world? Now,
That's a
I
good point.
want to quickly admit there are some New Testament passages that can be interpreted as formulating that view. I want to admit that. I think there's other ways to interpret those, but I just want to be blunt. I realize I'm facing some need for differing in biblical hermeneutics than what people are used to, but that's just something to try on for a
Yeah.
thought experiment.
Yeah. No, I actually, as you say that, I want to read page 14 where you say, you say, I believe an open and relational view of God makes the most sense overall, but I'm not certain. I don't know God fully, so I can't be 100% sure. I look at reality through limited and sometimes distorted lenses, which means my vision is cloudy. So, there's humility here in this. We're saying, okay,
Yeah, I have to have that.
this is where we're going. This is what we think best demonstrates our view of God. But we're gonna leave some things open in certain passages of Scripture. However, on the other side, you have passages in the Gospels where clearly Jesus does seem to have a choice.
Right,
He says in John's Gospel, "No one takes my life; I lay it down."
right. Yeah,
You have one of the things I've always pointed to is the temptation stories. That in
great.
order in order for the temptations of Jesus to be legitimate temptations, it means he had to accept the temptations, right?
Right,
I mean, you
right,
can't be tempted by something that doesn't tempt you, right?
right.
Right. I'm everybody who knows me knows I do not like fruitcake. All right. It's hard to tempt me with fruitcake, even if one's right in front of me. Well, unless Jesus actually can accept the devil's offer for all the kingdoms of the world. I mean, unless these are legitimate things the devil can give to Jesus and Jesus take them, then I don't the whole account makes no sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me
So
go back to
go
your
ahead,
the humility comment and
please.
say something else that I don't know might be controversial, maybe not. I suspect it might fit your experience, Alan. Um, some of the conversation partners I have, especially those who are, let's say, more on the evangelical or conservative side, they seem to prize the notion that you have this certain and sure theological foundation, that you got it, you can count on it, you can bank on it, you can use deductive logic to figure out what it is. And it's sort of, you got to have that. We even have songs that seem to point toward that sort of, I don't need any, don't need any faith. I've got this.
Yeah.
Um, that way of looking at theology is not humble. That way
Yeah.
of looking at theology is the opposite of that. Now,
Yes.
what I find happens is people realize the problem with that, and then they'll go toward what I find more often in more progressive or liberal scenarios. There, it's like enjoying the mystery of God, mystery this, mystery that, mystery the other. And after all, I'm thinking, okay, is it all mystery? Or are we actually making some claims about who
Yeah.
God is and what
Yeah.
God does? And what open and relational thought says is, we can make some real claims. We don't know this for sure. We're offering this as by faith, but there's also some reason behind this, and it fits our experience, and it fits the broad biblical witness. But we're not positive this is the
Yeah.
right way. And I think that's a nice middle way between absolute certainty and this utter mystery that I hear from some quarters.
No, I think we struggle, don't we? I read something, I don't know remember where anymore, but it was by a neurologist who said we almost seem hardwired toward binary thinking. We almost
Mhm.
seem hardwired toward either or.
Yeah,
So
good point.
if God is not controlling everything and ordaining everything, then God's doing nothing,
Yeah.
right? And there's no in between.
Yeah.
Which is one the other reason why I'm attracted to this, because it says, look, God's not an absentee landlord,
Right.
but God is not a micromanaging tyrant either.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Let's get to the problem of suffering, and I want to approach it from two opposite perspectives here.
Okay.
The first is that I think for some Christians, it's comforting when we can believe God has wanted something to happen that is you know it was I remember many years ago when I was in college, I had a friend whose mother died. She went in for a routine surgery and something went wrong and she died. And he was kind of estranged from his family at the time. And so he asked me if I'd stand with him at calling hours and greet people. I said I'd be glad to do that. And just the frustration with certain persons walking and greeting him and telling him they were sorry, but trying to comfort him by saying it's God's will,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there are Christians who take comfort in that.
Yeah.
I think we say some people will say everything happens for a reason, and of
Right.
course what they mean is a divine reason. Not,
Right.
I might trip and fall. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because I'm clumsy. It's not that God predestined that. But so let's talk about that first one. We do we some people, some believers find comfort in that. I mean, what do we say?
Yeah, it's difficult because I don't personally find comfort in it.
No,
And
no,
the
I don't
people,
either, but there are those
yeah,
who
I
do.
know you
Yeah,
don't. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. The people who say they do find comfort in it, at least in some cases, their comfort evaporates when more and more bad things happen.
that's
So
true.
maybe if you
That's
got
true.
one or two negative things, you kind of chalk it up to, well, it's somehow a part of God's mysterious
Yeah,
plan. But when you get an avalanche of evil,
yeah,
then you're starting to go, okay, there's
that's a
got to
really
be
good point.
something else.
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
and then there's the other about God teaching us a lesson. And you mentioned COVID and how many people,
yeah.
was it 2/3 of, I think you said something like that, 2/3 of Christians surveyed said God gave us COVID to try and teach us something.
Right.
I had people asking me that question as a pastor: Is
Yes.
God teaching something? To which I always said, no, God's not teaching a thing to us. God is God, but God is here mourning and loving us and being with us. But um, is that also because we really want to find answers for difficult problems?
I think so. Yeah, we want to find answers. And it is the case that sometimes we go through really crappy stuff and we see something good come from it. Now,
Yeah,
if we think God is the author of good, then we might think, well, God must have wanted the bad in order for the good to come about. So then you've got a God who's orchestrating what seems to be initially evil, but in the end is a good thing. And my response to that is to say, yeah, sometimes there are good things that come about after
you use
bad
the phrase in
things.
the book. God tries to squeeze good out of bad stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
God works to squeeze something good from the bad God didn't want in the first place. So if we affirm that, we can then rejoice in the good that might come after evil without pinning the evil on God, without saying God caused that evil thing or even allowed it as if God could have stopped it. And so we can salvage, I think, the truth that's there without blaming God.
yeah, yeah. I preached a sermon one Sunday as COVID, well, as we were starting to get better treatments and things. And I said, I can see good that's come out of this time. And I enumerated a few things. But I said, let me be clear. I am not suggesting for a moment God caused it. And
Yeah.
I am also not suggesting for a moment that if we could go back, I would want to do it again.
No, no, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So to say that something good came out of it is just to acknowledge that, as you say, and God can squeeze some good things out of calamity, but that doesn't mean that God caused it. So
Yeah, and even in that squeezing, I don't want to make it sound as if God alone is at work
good,
here, because I
good.
think God is calling us to play a role in what we'll call the squeezing process. And so, that's why it is the case that you look at, I don't know, let me take a mundane discomfort. Let's say the discomfort one of my students might go through in studying for an exam.
Mhm.
Well, it's not pleasant to have to, memorize things and or write a long essay or whatever, but we know that it's a good chance we'll be better for it at the end. And we have to play a role in making that happen. Now, if something horrific comes along, let's say it's a rape of your sister, well, is anything going to good come from that? Well, maybe there's some good, but we're not going to say, at least I'm not going to say, God wanted that. And whatever good can come from it, I think has to involve some kind of community coming around the victim and the victimizer in trying to redeem it in some kind of way.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where I think we always play a role.
Yeah, well, I think to use an example I'm familiar with that was egregious. There was a ministry in a previous community where I served of women who ministered to prostitutes, and they were all former prostitutes
Mm,
who had gotten out of that and then did ministry. Now, of course, there's no way they would go back and say, God wanted this to happen to me.
right.
And the abuse that they suffered that actually led a lot of them into this. But they squeezed something very
Hmm.
good out of this to help other
Yeah.
women, right? So
Beautiful example.
yeah,
Yeah.
and of course I have to also say when I've encountered people who've encountered that kind of suffering, and after they come out of it are able to, or after they work through it, are able to offer ministry to other people, I admire that.
Oh my,
I
yes.
just hugely admire that, their
Yep.
courage and their tenacity and their faith.
Yep. I totally agree.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the opposite end. So you got the opposite end, and this is probably a big problem today as well. You mentioned this in the book, and that is there are people who have rejected the existence of God. Or if they still believe in God, they don't want anything to do with that God because they say, God's all powerful, et cetera, et cetera. And yet he didn't stop the rape of my sister, or he didn't stop, my family all being killed in a car accident. So how do we respond to that?
Yeah, I hear this a lot. Just today on Facebook, I was involved in some private messaging
Yeah.
of some person who thought they had an either or choice. Either there is no God, or God is the omnipotent one who controls everything. And if those are your two choices, man, I'll be an atheist, to be
Yeah.
honest with you,
Yeah.
because the God who is in control of things is doing a really poor job of preventing evil in the world.
Yeah.
I say to that person, there is another alternative, an alternative that accounts for our deep intuitions about goodness, beauty, love, values, and who accounts for the activities in the world that draw us toward beauty, love, etc. And that's a God who always is at work in every situation, calling, empowering, inspiring, but never controlling. That God then is the one who can present to us possibilities given what's relevant, or given what's possible in the circumstances, to do what is best in that time and place. And that's a vision of God I find much more compelling, one that can deal with the Putins and the of the world, as well as our own individual suffering.
Yeah.
And that's the open relational vision.
Yeah. One of the aha moments I had several years ago when reading John Polkinghorne was when he said, wherever he said it, wherever I read it, that God gives even the universe the freedom to make itself.
Yeah.
And that just like the light bulb not only went on, it exploded because, and he talks about even uh, that God in creating a world where, like you and me, our human bodies, we develop from children, we develop, cells grow, they multiply, that by necessity in that kind of freedom, that also unfortunately gives way to the possibility of cells going haywire and we get cancer.
Right. Right. Yep.
In other words, if you want freedom, you if you want freedom, you've got to have other things that we would prefer not to have,
Yeah. Yeah. Or at least the possibility
or at
of
least the
it. Yeah.
possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
And
the word he would use, he talked about free will, like for humans, and then free processes of creation. And that's
yeah,
getting at what I think you're talking about there, that
yeah,
even if we don't think cells have free will, there are at least some free processes involved there.
yeah, yeah. And by the way, the other thing that all this did for me was help me understand that if this is God, if what you and I are ruminating on here is true, then creation through evolutionary process makes perfect sense.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's perfect sense. Same thing about the Trinity. I think it's Tom Wright who says somewhere that once you understand as much as we can understand the doctrine of the Trinity, evolution is the way a triune God would create.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
God wants to
Yeah.
be in relationship even with that creation, and relationships develop and grow, don't they?
Exactly. Yep. That's very well put.
I and I wonder, again, what kind of relationship would I have with my wife or my children or my grandchildren if we were unable to grow over time in that relationship?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that inherent in a relationship is that growth and freedom to grow and being in time. Why would God
Yeah.
have? Why? How could God have a genuine relationship with us and it be any different?
Yep. I mean, you want examples of the most unhealthy relationships. Look at the examples of men who try to control women or try to control their families. Like,
Mm-hmm.
talk about unhealthy.
Yeah, and none of that works. And yet, when it comes to God, we talk that way, don't we?
Yeah,
It
exactly.
is
Yep.
interesting that we do that. I continue to wonder about how. I mean, I know how this has happened, but it really sort of got embedded in our theological reflection early in the centuries, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely. We made God in the image of the Caesars and the
Yeah,
kings
yeah,
rather than in the image of Jesus, the servant, the
and
suffering servant.
yeah, and then once we started to get power in the fourth century, then that solidified it.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I've become very uncomfortable with uh, the reign of Christ Sunday, Christ the King Sunday, and I'm uncomfortable with that. But I'm uncomfortable with the portrayal of Christ with the crown of a king,
Right.
when I
Yep.
actually think it probably ought to be the crown of thorns.
Nice.
Uh, and I know Revelation talks about um, diadems and things like that, but it seems to me, one of the things that strikes me in reference to that, to go back to that, because you've got Revelation and all the imagery, but somebody said to me a while ago, and I have never forgotten it, is that the only time uh, Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah is once, and
Mm.
the lion is described as the slaughtered lamb, then from then on, it's always the lamb.
Mm.
It's never the
Interesting.
lion. And yet, how often do we portray Jesus as the lion, but not the lamb?
Yeah, yeah. Or Jesus, the one with huge biceps and guns and
Yeah, it's like, where did that come from? Where did that
yeah.
come from? Okay, so let's talk about this has been good with suffering. So the reality is, it isn't that God causes suffering. It isn't that God allows suffering. It's that the way God is, who God is, and the way God, because of who God is, the way God operates, he can't prevent suffering, but he's there, he's here, working and nudging, and we have a role to play. I mean, I like your emphasis on that because it reminds all of us the importance of what we do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And how we live.
I
I'm
like
not,
to say God can't prevent evil single-handedly, but
yeah,
God calls upon us to be God's hands and metaphorical hands and feet. And, assuming we respond and we're available, then we can prevent evils that God is calling us to prevent.
yeah. Okay, so let's talk about prayer then. Very practical thing people pray. By the way, we do pray as if there's some freedom there. We don't,
Yeah.
um, but in life, but I pray for a friend of mine or a family member who's very ill. What's up with that?
Yeah.
How does prayer work?
Is it all right if I give you 4 models of prayer, and the
Yep.
last one is going to be the one I like? All right.
Okay. Absolutely.
So, model number 1, we'll call it John Calvin's model of prayer. This is the idea that from the foundation of the world, God both predestined and foreknew everything that was ever going to happen. Now, if we're talking about petitionary prayer, and if you're a thoroughgoing Calvinist, man, I can't see how you could get motivated to pray that God would change something in the future, because the future's already been predetermined.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you would pray just because you're trying to be obedient to God and you're not, even trying to think about those. But if you were asking yourself, does my prayer really make a difference in the future? And you're a predestinarian, well, it doesn't.
Mhm.
Most people don't have that view of God, however, when they pray, even if they are Calvinists.
Right.
Most people have what I'll call an Arminian view of God, and it says something like this. Yes, our prayers can have an impact on God. God has the kind of power to fix anything, anytime, single-handedly. And if we pray and ask, God just might fix it single-handedly. Now, that way of thinking has some real problems with it. First of all, you wonder if God can fix things single-handedly, why God just doesn't up and do it without us asking.
Mhm.
Is God sitting back and saying, Allan, you really haven't asked me 387 times. You really got to get your prayers up here before I'm going to get off my butt and do something. It can also make it the case that it's that God, well, let me put it differently. If God's smarter than we are, and if God is perfectly loving, God would know what to do even if we never ask at all.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you are particularly motivated to pray in that sort of scenario. So when people see the first 2 models, and especially if they've been around the church a while and they see the problems with them conceptually, they'll shift to a third model that says this: prayers don't change God, they just change me. Now, I do think prayers can change us, so I think
Mhm.
that's important. And I don't think that prayers change God's nature, but I think what petitionary prayers are aiming to do is somehow change what God ends up doing in the future. And so this fourth model, I think, fits with the notion that our prayers can actually make a difference in how the future ends up being.
Okay.
So this fourth model assumes about 3 major things. One, it assumes that God's a relational God and God's affected by what we do. Second, it assumes that God moves through time moment by moment, and that our actions in one moment can open up new avenues and opportunities for God to act in the next moment. And then third, that not only is God relational, but we live in a relational universe. And the universe is affected by us and by God moment by moment. And in that kind of a scenario, if all those things are true, this fourth model says that our petitionary prayers to God can have an effect on God and can influence what God does in the next moment, because we provide informational data to God or relational opportunities to God that might not have been there had we not acted. Now, it doesn't mean that somehow our petitionary prayers make it so that God can be controlling in the next moment, because
Right.
I don't believe in a controlling God. But that way of thinking, it means that what we do really makes a difference without thinking that God is somehow becomes our pool boy and just does whatever we decide.
Right. Yeah. Um, One example of God with new opportunities and things changing, and it's not anything to do with prayer, but I was struck the first time I read, and I want to say it's Deuteronomy, but the children of Israel are in the wilderness and they're getting toward Canaan. They're getting ready to enter into the promised land, and of course God has given the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, but they're getting to the promised land, and God says to Moses, it says, okay, so you've been wandering all this time, he says, but now we're heading into the land where you will live, where you will settle. And so we got to revise some things. And he actually
Yeah.
makes some revisions in the law. right?
Right.
So much for the law being absolute, right? So God responds to this new situation in a way. It says, "Hey, we got to change a few things here."
Yeah, yeah.
So it means for me, this view of prayer means for me that my prayers matter.
Right.
And I have again, because I've got a lot of pastor friends who that's their view. My prayer just changes me, and I would say, no, no, no. It's got to be more than that. You can't
Yeah,
just,
yeah,
yeah, it does change me. You're absolutely right. If
yeah.
if I want to get changed, if I've got somebody who is if I've got a nasty neighbor and I don't like this nasty neighbor, if I pray for that neighbor, sooner or later, I'll start to feel different, right?
Sure.
And I know that. But there's got to be something about the prayer too that affects God and causes God to act again with us in the midst of the context. So, what do we make of healing? Um, there are sometimes. I believe if someone's cancer is treated conventionally and they're healed, I believe that God is involved with that. But what about some of the healings that we just can't explain?
Yeah. I think God is the source of all healing,
Mm-hmm.
whether it comes through traditional medicine, unconventional medicine, praying at the altar of your church, walking in the woods. Any healing that happens, I think God is the source, not the only actor, but the source of that healing. Now, I think healing can only occur when there's creaturely cooperation or the inanimate conditions of creation are conducive for that kind of healing.
Okay.
I say that because, I'm sure you're like me. You ask questions of why do some people get healed and others don't, and if you're like me also, why my prayers for healing seem to go unanswered.
Yeah.
um, and I think it has to do with either the conditions of creation not being conducive for the healing God wants, or at the cellular level or communal level, there not being cooperation. Now, I want to quickly say I'm not blaming victims. So if there's a cancer person dealing with cancer, I'm not saying to them, well, the reason you're not healed is you're just not praying hard enough. You're just not cooperating with God. I think oftentimes we can consciously be saying yes to God's power and inspiration and healing, saying, God, I want to be healed. I want to cooperate with you, but have cells, organs, muscles that aren't aligned for the kind of healing God wants to do. And since we don't control our bodies completely, since they have some agency of their own, some of those free processes we talked about earlier, that we can't control them, and I think God even can't control them. So the healing that comes, we praise God. When healing doesn't come, we don't have to blame God.
Yes. Okay. And then there will be some healings that probably we just can't explain.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And in those instances, I want to say, well, God was the source of that, but in some way there was creatures cooperating or conditions, and I just can't identify them at this point. But
Right.
in order for my theory to sort of work out and make God not responsible for the lack of healing, I
Right.
want to presuppose something like that happening.
Yeah, that's right. We're getting close to time, but I want to ask you. I'm going to ask you for just a final summation on some of this. But I was interested in reading. You talking about caring for creation, a very good section. But you tell the story about trying to free the coyote from the
Mm.
trap, which was illegal, but you didn't get caught, which is a good thing. And you said, but the great quote is, "I'd rather be an outlaw of love than comply with decrees of death." So I appreciated that. My
No,
thought was when
thank
I
you,
was
Allan.
reading that was, should we be vegetarians?
Yeah. Yeah, I've gone in and out of being a vegetarian over my lifetime.
Okay.
For certain health reasons, I still eat meat sometimes, but I'm very sympathetic and have been a vegetarian at some parts of my life.
Okay.
I think I think it's probably good to eat less meat, um, but I'm from the holiness tradition, and I've learned the problems with legalism. So I don't want to be a
Yeah.
legalist about this either.
Yeah. Yeah. But I appreciate your words. I'm not a vegetarian, but I become more conscious in recent years. Well, I have a brother who really has sensitized me to the factory farm and
Oh, yeah.
how animals really do a lot of suffering. And I don't, you know, I don't, I mean, I'm not a vegetarian, but I also don't want animals to suffer unduly. I think if we
Right.
believe that, as Jesus says, God knows if a sparrow falls from its nest. If God is that concerned about all of His creation, maybe we should whip up a little concern ourselves as
Yeah,
we
yeah,
go through this.
exactly.
But it was just a question that came to my mind. So in this final thing, anything, for you, if we've got some people who are watching or listening, and maybe some of this is new to them, and maybe they're not sure about some of this. I mean, what would you say to commend at least consideration of this open and relational theology?
When I speak in universities, churches, seminaries, conferences, and introduce open and relational thought, the big ideas that we've talked about today, and maybe some other ideas we haven't addressed, almost every time I do this, at the conclusion of my talk, someone walks up to me and says, I've kind of already been thinking those things. I've already believed them, but I just didn't have the words to articulate them. I say this because I think open and relational thinking fits our deep intuitions, fits the way most of us think about that life works. Now, it also has the advantage of fitting most of the way the biblical writers talk about God and
Mhm.
creation. I don't want to say all the biblical writers, but I want to say the preponderance of the majority witness of Scripture. So those two things in and of themselves, I think, have a lot to going for it in terms of recommending open and relational thinking.
Okay.
But the issue for me that is the most important is the issue of love. Because at the end of the day, I care most about living a life of love.
Mhm.
And this way of thinking about God and creation, I think, provides not only the best overall conceptual framework to make sense of love, but actually can be an inspiration or a motivation for me to love. Because if, we've talked about self love, for instance, I have a conceptual framework that fits this urge I have to look after my own good while also warning me not to become selfish.
Mm.
It's a framework that says there's a God of love who really cares about me as influenced by me, but also a God whose nature is always going to be loving and won't turn bad over time. So, all these kinds of details to me are important in my overall effort to live a life of love.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. Well, Tom, gosh, it's been a great conversation.
I enjoyed it too, Alan.
And gosh, this has been great. Do you guys have a date for your conference next year? You had that conference out there.
Oh, yes. Yeah. The ORTCON, Open Relational Theology
Yeah.
Conference. Yeah. It'll be July 10 through 14
Okay.
in Grand Targhee Resort, just between the Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone.
Okay. Well, I might try
You
and
know what?
get there. Right? I'd like
Oh,
to.
that would be
I'd
awesome,
love to
Alan.
get there. That's why I'm asking. You invited me this year, and I just couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
But that would
What
be
is it okay
wonderful.
if I make an offer to the folks who are watching this
Please,
program?
please.
Just in the last month, Sacrisage Press has released a 200-page sampler, is what it's called, that has chapters from about 5 of my books in it. I'll give you the link to that, and if anyone would like a free copy of that, a free PDF copy, they can just submit their email for my newsletter. You could get this free copy. If you decide you don't want the newsletter, you can,
Hmm.
unsubscribe. But it's a nice little thing that gives you an idea of some of the ideas, or it gives me, I'm sorry, a sample of some of the ideas that we've been talking about here.
Okay. Well, if you'll send me that link, I'll make sure it gets into the descriptions in both the pod and video cast so that they can get the link.
Excellent.
So
I'll do
thanks for
that.
that offer. That's excellent. Thank you. Well, friends, thank you for joining us on this premiere episode of Believing is Seeing. And a reminder that here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, our patron saint is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand." So, friends, keep seeking. Have a great day.